foundational thinker in the emerging field of neurodiversity studies and has made significant contributions in scholarship in that area. And I think her most well-known book is Neuroqueer Heresies, which has gained some significant attention, and is also an accomplished speculative fiction writer known for her urban fantasy webcomic Weird Luck. And when I think of Nick, I am always curious how you are able to do all of the things. And you are really, truly so transdisciplinary in your scholarship and in your creativity and in your work and your life. And so it's great to have you here. Nick contributed a chapter to the Creative Handbook for Creative Futures, which is the series that this is a part of with contributors from around the world, 37, I think, in total. We have another of them on the call today, Dr. Leslie Combs. Dan Glenn, welcome. Nice to see you.
Hi, Dan.
And
hi, Susan.
And so we're having just a great time interviewing and chatting with and having a conversation with our contributing authors. And so I think some of you have attended these before, might be the first time for a few of you. And so we spend usually the first 20 to 25 minutes of Alfonso and I asking questions. So we'll be inviting Nick to respond with reflections on the chapter and this work and its contribution to creative futures. And then we'll really open it up for discussion and reflection and questions from all of you. And we invite you, we're so happy to have a lively chat. If you want to just record quotes of Nick's or the conversation as we go along, have exchanges there as well. So it can be kind of dynamic in multiple places, and that we just invite that if you'd like to use it in that way. I think those are all of the things as we start. Is there anything else, Alfonso, you want to say before we begin?
No, I think that's
great.
That's it.
I will say I was at convocation yesterday for the university where I'm a professor, and I hadn't seen some of the students since the book came out, and one of the students who was very excited about it said to me, so are you done with that topic now? You know, is it over for you? You know, have you moved on? And it was just such a delightful moment, because I had this moment of like, this is a lifetime of work. And I think many lifetimes, if we think of the ancestors behind us and those generations ahead of us, and both the challenges and opportunities we have on this planet and as a species, and our co-living in with other species in this time. So anyway, that was kind of a delightful moment.
So we're not ready to put the future behind us.
Definitely not. And you're so good with the sound bites. I loved earlier in the first session when we were having a debate about the word better futures, Nick, and you know, better, and how Alfonso and I are kind of slightly at odds around that term, but that you offered the idea of yummier futures. And I just think that is such a great way to have a kind of broader invitation into how we can think of generative futures, better futures, desirable futures, all of the different adjectives we can think of to put before the word. So it's good to have you here, and all of you who are joining us. So the first question we ask all of our contributing authors is, what inspired you to take a deep dive into this particular topic? And I think I will read the title of your chapter just to give folks a bit of that orientation: the use of transformative somatic practices in processes of collective imagination and collaborative future shaping. So what inspired you to go in this direction?
Well, I guess it's where I've always focused a lot of my work. You know, I've been an aikido practitioner since the age of 12, and a teacher of aikido for almost that long. And so that's always been central to my work, is the somatic and how we make change through physical action and through the body. And that this process of self-transformation and group transformation, relational and collective transformation, always starts with the body and starts with how we embody ourselves and our consciousness, and that if we want to be able to do collective, collaborative processes and have harmonious relationships and creative, harmonious, generative interactions, that involves showing up in a certain way as ourselves. How do we show up as ourselves? What part of ourselves do we develop? How do we develop those potentials? And for me, that's always been something that's done through the body and through adjusting how we embody ourselves in order to cultivate different aspects of our consciousness and our potentials. And that to me has been clear since I started my Aikido training at age 12. What hasn't been clear is how to articulate it. And so that's the ongoing work always, and how to articulate it, how to move further along that path, because it's an endlessly generative and challenging path. But yeah, it's always been the heart of the work to me. And so, faced with this opportunity to write about creative futures, and particularly this idea of co-creating the future as a collaborative process, something that has to happen at a grassroots level among humanity and all its wild diversity. That was what came to me immediately, sort of intuitively, based on the nature of the work I do, was, well, if we're going to be able to work together like this, if we're going to be able to actually generate anything constructive, how we show up as our embodied selves is the basis, is the foundation for that.
It's great. Thank you. And you talk about a somatic approach. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means for people who may not be familiar with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea with somatics, or the field of somatic psychology, is removing the mind-body dualism that's kind of been baked into the cultural paradigm, a cultural paradigm which of course is crumbling now, which is why we're so interested in creating new and yummier futures, because there is this whole post-normal times thing. There is a crumbling of old systems. But one of those, the long-standing, I think, problems with the dominant systems that are collapsing now has been a mind-body dualism, in a sense of mind as something separate from body, in the sense that we're minds that ride around in bodies. That's a mechanistic attitude towards the body, which I think encourages a very control and domination oriented attitude, and I think it also fosters a control and domination attitude towards anything outside of the mind, towards nature, towards others. So that mind-body dualism, with somatic psychology, the idea is, well, what does psychology look like without that dualism? What does psychology look like when we say consciousness is an embodied phenomenon, and we are, as people, we are embodied cognition and embodied processes. Cognition is embodied, it's enacted through the body. The self and psychic processes are enacted through the body. So a lot of that goes back. I cite Wilhelm Reich in my work a lot, who was a mixed bag, a crackpot in many ways, but really had this brilliant idea early on in the development of modern psychology, because he started out as a student of Freud's. And Freud was always talking about these psychodynamic mechanisms, these psychological processes and mechanisms and dynamics, like repression. How do people repress things? How do people repress aspects of the self that aren't welcome in their developmental environment? And how does one recover repressed aspects of the self? And Reich's big sort of innovative leap around that was that repression is an embodied process, and it's something you can really see if you look at, if you've ever been around small children. You can really see if a child is trying to hold back something, a child doesn't want to cry or has been told not to shout or to sit still. There's a real physical effort they put into holding themselves back. And so Reich's idea was this holding back of aspects of the self eventually becomes unconscious and habitual and chronic. And that involves chronic muscular tension. That's actually a physical holding. And so if you release the physical holding, if you release the deep physical tensions, which Reich called character armoring, then you start recovering access to these aspects of the self. And so ideas like that we find in somatic psychology, this idea of, because the processes of the psyche happen through the body, we can then work through the body to work with the psyche. So cultivate or liberate aspects of the psyche by making conscious, intentional adjustments to our embodiment.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Do you have I have a question on the tip of my tongue, but do you have one?
Go ahead. I think we both have. No, it's your turn. Go ahead.
I mean, this is so interesting to me as I'm an academic and scholar, but also a facilitator of group process, of social creativity. And I'm really curious, how do you see, is somatic work of that, the integration of mind body, of an individual practice that we engage with, that then we can show up in collective work differently, or can you work it in collectives? I'm sure it's a bit of both, but I guess it's a bit of both. The question that I'm asking, I guess I should be really transparent around why, is that my experience of bringing in body and play into some facilitated spaces with groups is that what can be an incredibly transformative experience for one person can actually be a traumatic experience in another because of their own relationship with their body, with trauma, whether that's a generational history of trauma or an one that was accumulated in one's lifetime of experience. And so just really curious, somatics is such a big deal right now. Everybody's talking about it, but like, what are the care and considerations and questions around how we kind of navigate that self and collective and preparation and readiness or personal or history that feeds into it?
Right. Well, this is a great question. And of course, everyone's relationship, everyone's embodiment and their relationship with their embodiment is different and at a different place. But everyone's, cognition is different as well. And so I think that gets really brought into stark relief when we start working with embodiment. That people can have a conversation and you can see that they have different ideas and maybe they're not understanding each other. And at the most disembodied level, I think the most disembodied level of that is social media discourse. And on social media, misunderstandings rarely get resolved. They tend to escalate because the process is completely disembodied. And once we get into the room together and start interacting and there's a bodily presence involved, I think it becomes a little easier to recognize difference and work with it in some way. And when we are really actively working with the body, I think those differences become even clearer. And this is an asset. This is a benefit of working somatically, but it is, as you say, also a challenge, because when you get a bunch of people working somatically, they all do have they're carrying, one of the things bringing the somatics to the forefront of popular discourse in psychology these days is a book of Bessel van der Kolk's that's done so well called The Body Keeps the Score, and there's other other books, on somatics and trauma with titles like The Body Remembers. And so there's really, there's a clear message there that is very true, I think, which is people are carrying their developmental histories, including all of the trauma behind that in their bodies. And part of working somatically is getting to work through that and being able to work through it so that it no longer undermines one's processes of relationality, co-creating better futures, for instance, all of that stuff. But the initial challenge, as you say, you get people in a room together doing some somatic practice, and for some of them, it's like, oh yes, joy, bliss. And for others, it's like feeling into their body in these particular ways. Oh, there's all that trauma history right there. And suddenly they're having a terrible time, and it is not conducive to connection because they want to go and curl up somewhere. And so this is why I think it's crucial to operate at multiple scales and multiple sort of a certain amount of somatic work has to be done in a self-paced way. So solo practices are important, or practices in small groups of people who are very specifically like, okay, we're going to work with these particular traumas or these particular challenges. And that's building a necessary foundation for tolerating group somatic work of various kinds. And of course, this is what I love about Aikido, and I still find that an extraordinary practice. Really, there's nothing quite like it when it's done well, because it's so relational. And you have a group of people doing this very challenging work around fear and aggression and violence, challenging, physically vigorous, grabbing each other, flinging each other to the ground. And at the same time, this work is happening in a group setting, and it's also happening, but much of the practice is happening in partnership. And so people are working in partners. And so a person who's new to the work and at that stage of struggling to deal with all the trauma it brings up is going to be partnered with someone who's more experienced than them, who can help them. And there's this opportunity to do it in a more self-paced kind of way. Like, we don't have to go any faster than you're ready. We have this lovely student in our Aikido dojo who's 67, 68 years old, just coming out with a wonderful memoir about his experience as a Vietnamese immigrant. Lovely, sweet fellow, and very physically strong, very powerful martial artist at this advanced age. And whenever he has the opportunity to work with a beginning student, the first thing he says to them is, "We'll go slow." And just that kind of holding the space for each other, letting people know it's okay to go slowly with this. And I think that's really important, that we don't just put a bunch of people in the room and assume that they can all handle a given exercise, but where are the opportunities to take a given exercise and have the space held for doing it at one's own pace before one comes into more intense levels of interaction. So it is a complex process. And of course, I think anything worthwhile is a complex process, and it involves a lot of space holding, and it involves a lot of freaking out too, a lot of and I still after 42 years of Aikido training, I still hit points in my practice where I'm like, whoa, I'm into some scary territory here. I'm gonna push forward and work through this, but this is like scary stuff I'm discovering here. This is the next level of scary letting go to do. And so I think that's important to honor. And I think it's also easier to honor when you're in the bodily realm. I think, again, if you're trying to discuss something with someone on Twitter and you have a disagreement, telling them, I can see that it scares you to let go of this fixed idea. They're just going to get really offended and you're going to have a flame war, or they're going to block you or something. But when you're working with someone bodily, that fear is much more palpable and much more present. And it's how do we be present together with the fear of letting go of this? And it becomes much more empathic.
Thank you. That's really a layered, many layers of response, and I really appreciate it. Alfonso, do you have a question before we open it up for others? You are muted, by the way. You're muted.
Yeah. I suppose I have one question related to sort of the larger process of change and transition that we're going through globally, I think, and how that then relates specifically to sort of defensiveness and aggression and stuckness in a way, right?
Yes.
Versus the ability to flow and create together, because you talk about that in the in your chapter, and I think that's just so important, and I think that sort of played out in some respects. I wouldn't even say that one side is particularly guilty. I think in some ways we're all dealing with defensiveness and stuckness and fear about what's happening in the world. But could you just sort of elaborate how that all plays out somatically?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at the ways people get stuck in an idea or an ideology, or stuck with like just a sticking point of, oh, I can't allow this, the fear. And I think that's a very real fear when it comes to being open to a new idea or moving forward into creating something new. And we see that around just people who are very threatened by ideas that are alien to them or new to them, or that they've had they're not sure how it's going to work. I mean, you see that in transphobia, for instance, is an example that I encounter a lot these days, because it's very up in the discourse. And being in the early stages of a gender transition myself, I get to see a lot of the transphobia and how it is really a phobia. It's really grounded in fear. And I hear people actually, in the social justice communities, object to this term phobia, and want to treat it as like, okay, this is like trans, anti-trans hate or something. But it's more compassionate, I think, to really recognize the fear behind it, that there's a shift happening around how gender is done, some transcendence of old gender binaries and fixed, lifetime gender categories. And that shift is scary to people because they can't imagine where it goes. There's this fear of like a slippery slope. Like if we get rid of this, it's like playing, what's that, Jenga, the game with the tower where you pull out pieces of the tower of blocks. And it's like, okay, if we pull out this piece, like what if everything collapses? They can't, imagine how this could work. And it's a very threatening, like, oh, this will bring my whole worldview down. It's scary. And the resistance to that from a somatic perspective is bodily. It's a bodily resistance of there's a physical fear response. And the story about it, the narrative in the mind, the narrative that says, this could lead to this problem and this problem and this problem, what if you know, all that like what if, what about, all these scary narratives, I think actually come from the physical fear response. This is a very interesting thing that happens with human psychology, is that people have their physical responses, and often the narratives that they weave are attempts to explain what's happening in their bodies and what they're feeling in their bodies. You know, very interesting recent book out by Lisa Feldman Barrett, brilliant neuropsychologist, called How Emotions Are Made. Highly recommend this, How Emotions Are Made, where it's like there's been this long-standing idea that emotions are innate, you know, like there's these, you know, there's these like hardwired systems in the brain to feel particular emotions. But this, what Barrett discovered in the extensive research is that in fact, what there is there's bodily sensations, and people spin narratives around their bodily sensations based on the context. And emotions kind of come from that. So a given bodily sensation might be interpreted as anger, and a person can create an anger narrative around it in some situation. And in some other situation, a person might just be like, oh, I'm hungry. Because the bodily, you know, the bodily sensations are actually fairly vague until we put a story to them, interpreting them. And so I think what happens is that people get confronted with a new idea, or, you know, like, okay, we have to let go of the gender binary in order to accept this idea. And there's a physical reaction to the new, to something that disrupts existing patterns of thought. There's a physical reaction, and the narrative the person spins around it is what we see on the surface. What we see on the surface is all these bizarre, like anti-trans fears, and you know, just the discourse of transphobia. But what's really happening at the baseline is what's happening in people's bodies when confronted with uncertainty. And so we can't work within a non-somatic way. You can't talk people out of these stuck places, I think. You can, but they can get out of those stuck places through the body, through this process of where is the stuckness actually happening in the body? Can you change the stuck reaction in the body? Can you change the thing that's locking down in the body? And that frees up the thinking mind to have better narratives. It frees a person up to be open to a different narrative once they're not having the bodily fear response of locking down. And those bodily fear responses tend to be unconscious. And so there's this whole process of becoming conscious of what the body is doing and letting go of it. And again, that's something that you're not going to get in a conversation with someone directly necessarily, but you can facilitate it. You can facilitate it somatically. If you get people present, physically present with each other, even on Zoom, you can facilitate, you know, you can get a facilitator in there who can keep drawing people's attention back to, okay, what's happening in your body right now, rather than what are all the stories you're spinning about what you're feeling, you know, all the stories you're spinning in reaction to what you're feeling in your body. What's actually happening in the body? Let's make a shift in that. And that makes room for a new story potentially.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is, go ahead, Gabrielle.
Well, just seeing it as such an essential key in shifting. I mean, we were just, Alfonso and I talked so much about, I mean, part of this book, the Creative Futures book, is also around the narrative that people hold about the future and how that shapes the present. And I mean, speaking obviously in the context of transphobia, which was such a helpful example, but then to kind of broaden that out in the ways we're creating narratives and stories all of the time based on a sensation or fear in the body.
Yes.
Yeah. And so what that can open up for us.
Right. Yeah, I can't help but ask one more question as sort of a follow-up on this. I remember when I was a kid, there were a lot of long hairs around, right? And there were people who would men who would get upset, walking behind a person with long hair. They couldn't figure out if it was a man or a woman, right? And this was upsetting to them, right? And I always found that fascinating. And, I think sort of following up on this, there's a sense to me that my identity walking behind this person with long hair, if I sense myself, if I sense a physical reaction of attraction that is culturally deemed wrong and is not the identity that I believe I have, and that I feel that if I felt, feel what I think I'm feeling would be terribly wrong, it in a way, it blows up the whole sense of who I am, right?
Right. That there's a guy, a hetero man raised in this patriarchal culture just can't be like, hey, that guy had a nice ass, and like they can't let themselves think that. And so whatever, it's whatever they can't allow themselves to think ends up getting projected outward as violence against the other and fear of the other.
Right. But I think that's that sort of sense of identity, of certain, male identity at this point, sort of being severely challenged by going beyond these binaries, because male identities are very identified with these binaries, right? I'm a boy to the extent that I don't do things that girls do, and I don't feel that way, and I don't act that way, right?
Yeah.
But to have that break down is very, very threatening, right? I think that's one of the sort of one of the challenges for the future, obviously, is this emergence of new, arguably richer and more creative and more pluralistic identities, right?
Absolutely.
That go beyond these limitations. So but there's still a very strong sort of cultural sense there, in a way, in terms of certainly how men are supposed to be.
And we're seeing it in the thinking around the transphobic discourse in particular. We're seeing this, the turf phenomena, the sort of bizarre alliance between like right-wing patriarchy and old school like second wave feminists. And that's really interesting because it's like, okay, like the men have built their identity around this gender binary, around this, toxic masculinity model of what it means to this limited, like what it means to be a man. But there's this, there's women also who've built their identities oppositionally to hating the patriarchy and hating men, and can't let go of the idea that, like, anyone born with a penis is the other and is the enemy, and we have to maintain this us and them, because otherwise their sense of identity also falls apart.
Right. Anyway, this could be a much longer discussion, so I think we should open it up to our wonderful participants here.
And I have a feeling that people might want to stay here as well. I mean, there's been some great comments and discussion happening in the chat here, and Lisa has offered a question actually that in many ways builds on this. And Lisa, you're welcome to speak it in if you'd like, or I can read it, but I see you come on camera, so we'd love to hear your voice to start us off.
Thank you. Well, I know we're talking, first of all, great to see you, Nick. This is really very exciting for me. And I know we're not centrally only talking about transphobia, but I have a child who moved to an area that is my child is non-binary, identified gender non-conforming, and moved to an area that is a military town. And within a few short weeks, changed their name back, is starting to shift their pronouns back, and, you know, finding they have to go back in this dual identity because they're very afraid of being beat up.
Mhm.
So in some ways it's a protection. And they even asked me, how can I help people see things different? Like, how do you get a bunch of Navy guys to not be transphobic? And I'm like, that's something that, you know, these are inherited conversations. So in terms of the creative futures invitation, we're being asked to see how can we be, you know, people to be shifting perspectives. So for me, it's coming a bit as a mom, but also as a scholar and as a, you know, someone who's working to break down binaries, which I think we have to. You know, that's part of sort of seeing I don't know if it's the end of gender binary, but I think if there's going to be, how do we help people stay steady if they're going to be pioneers? I don't know, maybe that's a loaded question, but I want to help both my child, but also help us continue to push forward, not retreat back out of our own phobia.
Mhm. There are times when camouflage is essential for survival, though, you know, and there are times when, you know, being stealth and undercover in various ways is valuable. And it's just, the question becomes, where can we do this work? Where can we do, like, what's and this again comes back to Aikido and comes back to the somatic, that there's this lesson of working with what is, you know, what's the actual, in order to build a future, in order to intentionally create a future, we have to start with the present. We have to start, you know, there's this relationship between the actual and the possible, that we have to say, well, there has to be some path, however convoluted and complex it might be, from here to there. And what is here? What are the existing conditions? And where are the openings to start this work? And I think one place people get stuck is thinking it has to be all or nothing, or, oh, if I can't do this, I can't do anything. And that negativity is part of what what needs to be changed. We're talking about, you know, positive futures, yummier futures, looking for the positive is crucial. And again, looking at social media as an example of how not to do it, you know, I will post or see other people post things on social media, ideas for, you know, some sort of positive change. And frequently what one gets, you know, not from like the haters who are violently opposed to it, but from people who actually want a similar future, the initial response that one gets is all of these reasons why it couldn't possibly work. And all they can see is where they're stuck. And Aikido, Aikido taught me not to do that, because certainly everything in my childhood trained me to have an extremely negative view of the world and sort of a sense of learned hopelessness around things. But Aikido undid that for me over time, because it's very much on a physical level about learning to look at where one isn't stuck and where something can happen. And so we do this stuff where, like, okay, somebody grabs your arm and they're strong and you can't pull away effectively. And that's like, we do this over and over, you know, in an Aikido class. Here's somebody grabs your arm as hard as they can and you can't pull away. What can you do? It's relax deeply enough and you start to be able to feel where there is some place you can move. And that's the right place to move. There's somewhere where parts of your body that can move, or particular ways you can move that arm, and once you start moving the things you can move, your position and your relationship with the other body changes. And eventually, more and more options start to emerge from starting where you can. And so that's, I think, crucial in terms of cultural shift, is you don't start by like, you know, going up to a bunch of violent bigots and trying to convince them to change their minds. You start with the people who are like adjacent to you and possibly open to what you have to say. And you start there, and where are there openings? Or like, I think about the work of Daryl Davis. He's an interesting character. He's the guy who, a Black musician who sets up dialogues with members of the KKK and persuades them over time to leave the KKK. He like talks them out of their racism over time. But the key to what he does, and he has like a collection. He has like a giant collection of Klan robes from people who've like left the Klan, and be like, here, you can have my Klan robes as a souvenir. Like, that's really effective. Whatever he's doing is effective, but what he's doing is setting up one-on-one conversations. And that's very different from showing up at a Klan rally and try to change everyone's mind because they've got this group support. You know, people in groups are often, you know, really stuck in their ways. They're getting support in their stuckness from other members of the group. But a one-on-one dialogue, body to body, face to face with a single other person, change can happen sometimes. And so it's like, okay, that's where there's room for movement. If somebody agrees to sit down and meet with him, that tells him right away, oh, that means there's an opening. Like, that's a place where movement can happen. And so I think that's important. Is you look at like one of my favorite stories, just is like in terms of social change happening, is, you know, when I was a kid, within my lifetime, homosexuality was in the DSM. You know, it was a DSM diagnosis. It was pathologized. You could be institutionalized for being gay. And the depathologization of homosexuality is removed from the DSM, and the decision, you know, by the American Psychiatric Association that they weren't going to consider it a mental disorder anymore. That didn't come from clients, like gay clients protesting, because there's no room there. There's no room for gay clients to convince their psychiatrists, oh, I'm not crazy to be gay, because of the way the power relation is set up. But what happened was, you started the people in the American Psychiatric Association, the decision makers there, started hearing from like other members of their own association who were like tired of being in the closet, and they started hearing from their own gay family members about it. And that was crucial, that there were relationships already in place in which there was room for change to happen. And so I think that that's important, and that's a lesson that, again, Aikido teaches on a physical level. I want to keep bringing this back to the embodied, that on the physical level, we have to learn a couple of things and teach people a couple of things. And one of them is this idea of learning to recognize where there is room for movement and going where there actually is room for movement. And two is, as a foundation to that, in fact, what changes, what shifts and releasings and letting go has to happen in our own bodies and our own embodied consciousness in order to be able to feel where there's room for change.
I'm fortunate to have done some Aikido to know where those openings are. And I
Mhm.
love the invitation to bring that embodied experience and probably many other different embodied practices into ways of being. So this is really exciting. Thank you.
Sure.
Elaine.
Well, this is awesome. My interest is in transforming schools,
Mm.
and people spend a lot of time there, and they have a lot of opportunities to experience trauma there. But it
Mhm.
could, I have to believe that it could be a better experience. And sometimes it is. And, kind of what I'm interested in is reducing the fear of change,
Yes.
right? The physical experience of fearing change. Because a lot of people, um, a lot of educators, a lot of people at the university level, they they have a desire for change,
Hmm.
but when like facing it, they have a physical fear experience,
Yes.
and that kind of causes that shut down, or you know overreacting to ambiguity. So I'm kind of like, if I'm trying to create a little more space for change, and my interest is in transcendental meditation in schools, and it
Mm.
really does change the experience for students and teachers
Yes.
to meditate every day.
Hmm.
um,
Absolutely.
and it changes the way we interact. um, but do you have some thoughts about how to, um, what could we do on a small level, in small groups, say in schools, just to reduce that sort of reactionary physical experience, so that we could see more possibility?
Yeah.
And that to me, that's the creativity part.
Yes.
Is that
Absolutely.
it is that when you become open to possibility, when you see those small avenues, you can follow that a little bit, and it changes the outcome because you
Right.
didn't stay stuck. If people don't stay stuck, there's just more creativity. Something new happens. So, is there some physical thing we could do in small groups
Yeah.
that would help people?
What I recommend, I mean, transcendental meditation is wonderful. I recommend something that involves some movement too, that involves sensing and feeling what's happening in the body while it's in motion and in interaction, and developing this habit of feeling the body. And there's a verbalizing habit. This is something that I teach somatic psychology students, that I think is really important, of describing describing what's happening in the body, describing the physical sensations and the physical phenomenon without interpretation. And so, um, if you ask a person what they're feeling, uh, often, what they'll tell you instead is what they're thinking and what their narrative is. And that includes naming emotions, which is again, taking it back to this how emotions are made idea, that when we describe our bodily sensations as anger or fear or whatever, that's an interpretation of our sensations. And what we actually need to do to work somatically is to get below that, because there's actually a lot of different bodily manifestations that we can label as anger. It's actually a very vague term, or a lot of different bodily sensations that we can label as fear. These are not as informative as they sound. And so, this what's helpful is a somatic facilitation where you keep getting people attuned to what's really happening in their bodies, to the specifics. And so, getting them past the narrative of they're just complaining about the idea and how it won't work, and getting them past the narrative of when you say feel, them saying, well, I feel really angry and afraid, like that's honest of them, but it's not necessarily helpful. And getting them past that to, well, what's actually happening in your body right now? When we bring up this idea, what happens in your body? What do you feel happening? And can they describe what's really happening in terms of what happens with their breathing? Where are the bodily tensions? And then you can facilitate a letting go of that. How does this idea seem now? If you're actively deepening your breathing and slowing your breathing, how does this idea land now? So that sort of facilitated somatic process, I think, is extremely valuable with the process. And it does involve having an experienced facilitator to hold the space who can avoid getting caught up in the conversation of, well, why are you afraid? Or what are you afraid will happen? And instead keep bringing it back to what's actually happening in your body and what happens if we shift that.
I like that. It reminds me when I attended a funeral with a friend, and we were holding hands and we were just paying attention to what was happening. And all of a sudden, the temperature of her hand spiked.
Yeah.
And I looked over and she had started to cry.
Mm-hmm.
But I would not have known that if I weren't holding her hand. I would not have known that. And so that's kind of sometimes there's just something, my body got warmer. This is why it works so well with younger people,
Oh, yeah.
children, early adolescents. They'll just tell you, my stomach started to feel like it was moving a lot, right?
Yes.
As opposed to attaching some meaning to that. They could just tell you what it is.
Right.
That helps me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm so glad. Thank you for asking.
I know that there are more questions in this group, and we're also at time, and I just want to respect everyone's calendars and showing up today. And so please, I'm sure, Nick, there'll be other opportunities for folks here to connect with you and ask you questions, and just really appreciating you coming today, sharing this with us, taking us further, and opening up possibilities. It's a really tremendous gift. Your work is a real gift. So thank you so much, Nick.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, everyone, for coming and asking questions and being here.